and welcome to part 5. So far in part 1, we learned that Jesus is a real person in history. Fact. In part 2, we learned that he claimed to be God. And in part 3, we learned that his disciples believed that he was God, those closest to him. And in part 4, we learned why Jesus had to die on a cross. Why couldn't he just forgive us and that's it? And our relationship with God and our sin would be forgiven instead of him dying. Well, today I want to speak to you about why Christians believe that the resurrection actually happened. So there are some facts that everyone will agree upon. Number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. That's a fact that even atheists won't argue with. It's a fact. Jesus Christ died on a cross. They crucified him. Crucifixion was a very common kind of execution during the Roman Empire. Jesus Christ was not the first person to be crucified and surely wasn't the last. That was very common during the reign of the Roman Empire. Another fact that people won't argue with is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. That's not a secret to anyone. Everyone agrees with that. They don't agree with the disciples, but the fact that they believed it and that they believed it so strongly that they were willing to die for what they believed they saw, no one's going to argue with that. That is a fact. The third fact is that Paul, who used to be a persecutor of the Christians, was somehow radically transformed. That's a fact. It's historically proven. Atheists won't argue with it. That's a fact. He was transformed. People don't know why, but all of a sudden he went from putting Christians in jail to being a Christian and claiming that he saw Jesus. And the fourth fact that no one will argue with is that James, who was the brother of Jesus and who was a skeptic who didn't really believe that Jesus was God, was all of a sudden changed and transformed and all of a sudden believed that Jesus was God. All right, so these are 4 facts that no one will argue with. So now that we have these 4 facts, we have to make sense of them. So here we have Jesus Christ dying, who died on a cross, and people are claiming to have seen him. How do you explain that? And not just one person, many people. And not only that, but they're believing it so strongly and they're so sure that they saw this that they're actually willing to be tortured for this lie. I don't know about you, but if I were lying about something and someone was torturing me to get the truth out of me, I would eventually cave in. I would not be willing to die for my lie. I understand that in many world religions, people die for their faith. That's very common in all religions. Muslims die for their faith. Buddhists will die for their, anybody will die for their faith. But these people didn't just die for their faith. They died because of something they claimed happened. And people were telling them, no, that didn't really happen. And they're like, no, we saw it with our very own eyes. We saw Jesus after 3 days of his burial, and we saw him for 40 days. And that's what they died for. They didn't just die for their faith like, other religions. They died because of what they saw, because of their testimony. They said, we saw him, all right? And because we saw him, that proves that he's God, because you guys killed him. And 3 days later, we saw him, and we didn't just see him for 1 day, we saw him for 40 days. So how do we explain these facts? And I know how I explain it. I kind of just, and Christians do, we just believe their testimony. We believe they saw what they saw. But what do other people believe? So one of the things that unbelievers think may have happened is maybe Jesus only appeared to die. Maybe it just looked like he died, but he didn't really die up on that cross. Well, what's the problem with believing this? Well, first of all, that's medically impossible. The Romans were professional executioners. If they hadn't really killed him, their heads could be on the line. All right, they had to do their job well. So thinking that these Roman soldiers made a mistake and didn't really kill him and that he just got better 3 days later is medically impossible, especially with the wounds that he had. He had lashes and beatings, and they pierced him in his rib cage, and it would have been medically impossible to think that he only appeared to die. Another theory that people have is that the disciples lied and just stole Jesus's body, that they just deceived everyone and stole his body. What are the problems with believing that? Well, that would not explain why the disciples were willing to die for what they claimed happened. And not just one disciple, but several of them that claimed to have seen him all died because they were saying this was truth and people were saying it wasn't. So that wouldn't, someone was eventually going to cave in and be like, you know what, we lied, we stole his body, but no one caved in. they held on to this truth to the point of death. So thinking that the disciples lied and stole Jesus' body is not rational. Another thing that people think is, well, maybe someone else, not the disciples, stole Jesus' body. Well, that doesn't explain Paul and James claiming to have seen him. That doesn't explain how they claim to have seen him, and that just shows how the tomb would have been empty. But how about the whole part of seeing Jesus for 40 days? So that doesn't make sense. Okay, people claim to have seen him, and they died claiming that they saw him. Another theory that people have is, well, maybe witnesses went to the wrong tomb and that's why it was empty. Okay, once again, that doesn't show us why people would have claimed to have seen him afterwards, okay? And another thing, and this is a pretty famous one from that movie, God's Not Dead, is that the people who saw Jesus were hallucinating. So just so you know, hallucinations are actually very common when people are grieving. When someone has lost a loved one, sometimes they hallucinate. It's really normal. But to think that all these people were hallucinating and having the same hallucination makes absolutely no sense. That is impossible. And also, it doesn't explain why Paul, who wasn't even there with the disciples, he wasn't one of them, why would he have his conversion and claim to have seen Jesus? Doesn't explain that. All right. So the list of theories of what really happened and why people claim to have seen him and were willing to die saying this, there's many of these theories, but none of them make sense, to be honest. The only theory that does make sense is that maybe what the disciples said happened actually happened. Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And listen, I completely understand that this is something that people are like, listen, how can you even believe that? I read this example one time to help us Christians understand why atheists find it so far-fetched that we believe this. And they gave this example. They said, imagine that you're babysitting 3 kids. You go into the house, you send the kids outside to play, you're laying on the couch, keeping an eye on them, and then you're just reading this good book while they're outside playing. All of a sudden, 30 minutes later, they all come in screaming, and they're pale in the face, and they're saying, oh my goodness, we just saw pigs flying outside. And then you breathe a sigh of relief because you thought something was really, really wrong. And then you're like, oh, okay, they're just pretending. But these kids are adamant about it. They're like, no, we really, really saw pigs flying outside. And they go off to explain all this evidence and everything they saw about these pigs flying outside. And you're just not budging. Why aren't you budging? Well, because you know that pigs can't really fly. So no matter how much evidence they give you, unless the pigs walk in and stand right in front of you with their wings, you're not going to believe. And that's what happens with a lot of unbelievers. They're like, people don't just come back from the dead. That's impossible. So no matter how much evidence you give them, they just refuse to believe because it's just not naturally or scientifically possible for someone to come back from the dead. But you see, that's why we don't just claim that a human being came back from the dead. We're claiming that God came back from the dead. And if I'm going to worship a God, he better be able to come back from the dead. He better be able to have power over death. He better be able to perform these miracles that they claim he performed. He better be able to calm the seas and calm the winds. He needs to have that power. If the God that I worship can't come back from the dead and do that, he's not worth me worshiping. Which is why when we say that Jesus came back from the dead, and that there's all this evidence proving that he was seen and all these testimonies and eyewitness testimonies, it makes sense because human beings can't do that, but my God, if there is a God, he should definitely be able to do that. And that's why as Christians we believe the resurrection, because it's the only rational explanation to the facts. It's the only rational explanations that can explain why the disciples would be willing to die for this truth, what they claim a truth. It's the only rational explanation that can explain Paul and James' conversion. That maybe, hey, they really did see Jesus after 3 days and they really did hang out with him for 40 days. And if it really is God, he should be able to do that. And that's why we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the center of Christianity. And I think that's why God didn't just say, hey, Jesus didn't just say, hey, just believe that I'm God because I say so. No, he said, you know what? I want you to believe that I'm God, and I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to come back. After they kill me, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to show you that I defeated even death itself. All right, guys? So that is why us Christians believe in the resurrection, which is the core of our belief, because there is so much evidence that proves it's the only rational explanation to all the evidence we have. All right, guys? Love you. Bye, and happy Resurrection Sunday and Good Friday, and we hope you enjoy the festivities in your house being quarantined. Bye.